All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're here with my friend Darrell Epp to talk about his brand new book, Permanent Smoke. And so, Darrell, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have this time with you.
Hi there. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. So today's conversation is going to be a little bit different, have a different feel to it because Darrell is not just the author of yet another nonfiction book or a fiction book, but he's a poet. And this is a book of poems. And I've never had a poet on the show before. So this is pretty cool. But Darrell, the first thing I wanted to ask you is I'm really curious, why poetry? Like, how on earth did you get into writing poetry? Because I know that writing nonfiction is very different from writing fiction, but poetry, how does one get into writing poetry and how is it unique to these other genres of writing?
I hope you weren't expecting a short answer to that question.
Give
Um,
me the dissertation.
yeah. Well, I've done a lot of different kinds of writing, and in the 1990s, I worked in the theater where I wrote plays and helped to train actors, and that was really a good time. And then I wrote fiction, short fiction, journalism, and then around 2004. um, I was writing short fiction that people told me was very accomplished. I was getting published, but to me, it felt too much like my influences, like my favorite writers,
Hmm.
um, where I was always a reader. I was reading, literature, and I was always concerned that I sounded too much like my favorite authors,
Mhm.
where 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 even if people liked it, it just didn't seem, to have a point where
Mhm.
um, there already is a Sam Shepard. But so why would the world need two of them, right? And also, I was concerned that I was rambling. And in poetry, anyone can tell when you're rambling because it just looks off, it just smells off. Anyone can tell.
Mm.
So that discipline really appealed to me. So around 2004, I went to poetry as a vacation and um, ended up staying there. Where when I went to poetry, I could talk about the things that always had concerned me, but because I didn't come from a poetry background, suddenly my voice seemed kind of fresh. Where I read science fiction novels as a child in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, everything has become science fiction,
Mm.
and the science fiction novel form had a lot of bits and pieces that didn't appeal to me, and all I cared about was the strangeness and the imagery and the tones.
Mm.
So in poetry, I can write what I consider science fiction, but just paint the picture and just leave it there without the he said, she said, and the buildup. So um, it's funny, poetry, some people might think it's old fashioned, but actually, it seems to have a lot more in common with the way we live and communicate now than, a novel structure.
Mm.
Um, Also, I'd have to say, a long time ago, I read a poem by a poet named Edgar Allan Poe, and the poem was called Alone. And it basically had everything I wanted in a poem, where it had a great beginning, a great ending, um, imagery that you hadn't seen before,
Mhm.
and every line had a surprise in it. And when you first read the poem, it feels like it's just a guy bearing his soul to you, like this big outburst of passion from a real soul.
Mhm.
But when you actually break it down, you find that it's actually full of craft. But he was just enough of an artist to hide the wires, so
Mm.
you don't see like the ligaments
Mhm.
and the nuts and bolts. You just are along for the ride.
Mm.
So I always thought, wow, that's a really impressive feat, and wouldn't it be great to make someone else feel that way?
Mm. Yeah, one of the things when I was reading your book and your poems, it almost felt like you were painting like a backdrop for me, kind of like you said about science fiction, like you're painting the scene, but yet my mind was doing all the work with the characters. Like it wasn't like you were giving me what he said, she said. It was just here's the scene, and where's your heart and your mind going to go with it? and that's what intrigued me so much about it.
Well, it's kind of funny. One thing that I really get a kick out in literature is a strategy called gapping,
Mm,
where um, like you know how when you watch Othello, you think to yourself, why? And you think, why is Iago such a jerk? And then you think, why? Why does Othello believe him instead of Desdemona? It doesn't make any sense.
mm,
And the reason Shakespeare doesn't tell you, the reason Shakespeare is a genius is because he doesn't tell you. Where as soon as he has, as he, if he explains it, oh, it's because his dad spanked him too much or
mm,
bad potty training or something. As soon as you explain it, it becomes inert and it's
yeah.
like a dead thing. But when Shakespeare presents these people and doesn't give you the why, he's saying, "Yeah, welcome to Earth. It's messy, right?"
Right.
So the worst thing in a story is when the writer talks down to you and fills in all the blanks for you. And this is one thing Anton Chekhov was a master of. Where imagine a story where everything in the story is leading up towards this one
Hmm.
final beat, and you stop telling the story a semitone before that. When you do that, first off, it will make the reader's interest level go up.
Hmm.
He'll say, what happened?" And then the reader will have to think, well, did she say yes or did she walk away? And then the reader will end up thinking about the story the next day and end up imagining what happened in those blanks.
Hmm.
And then the reader becomes a participant in creating the fictional world and just gets way more out of it. Um, Also, David Mamet, who wrote Glengarry Glen Ross,
Mm,
um, he had he has two pieces of advice for people when they're writing,
mhm,
and it's the best advice ever. And he said, um, in every story and in every scene in the story, arrive late, leave early.
mm,
Okay, so let's say you're watching a movie about a bank robbery, and they're planning the heist. So they come in and say, "Hello, I think we should rob a bank." "Yes, I'm also a bank robber. Let's plan a bank robbery." Right? It doesn't sound real. It has all these problems to it. But if you start the story and you know that these people have already known each other for 20 years, they've already been through this, so they just start saying like, what do you think about the thing? Is it good to go? Um, because the reader has this sense that he has to prick up his ears and hurry up to get up to speed.
mhm,
Again, it makes it more interesting for the reader. Um, Plus, leave early. Um, by the end of the story, the reader should know how these characters will act in a situation where you don't have to tell them, you know, what happened next because you'll know, and also it's way more satisfying. So arrive late, leave early, and it
mm,
also means don't talk down to your reader. Always talk up to your reader. Where um, I'm assuming that my reader is, as smart as I am, and that he's lived a few years on Earth, so that there are some things, I don't have to explain. And also, it's obvious in my book that there are some things I'm concerned about. There are some global trends that I find alarming,
mhm,
but if I talked about them in a nonfiction way or made a sermon about them, then it would just be like Abraham Simpson, old man yells at cloud,
right,
you know,
yeah,
where it's like, oh, it's a sermon, and people don't like hearing sermons, and they don't remember sermons, and like brains just don't work that way. Right? But if instead you give people this ride, and along the way in this ride that is hopefully entertaining, once in a while they're like, oh wow, yeah, it's true. Technology really has changed the way we relate to each other. Or if they think, oh yeah, they said love thy neighbor, but due to changes in technology,
mhm,
my neighbor never goes outside. So how is that? How is it possible to love your neighbor with these advances in technology? Oh
Mm.
well, and hopefully, after people finish reading the book, they think about this a day later or a week later or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, I think it works. It's almost like a parable, right? I mean, that's why I think Jesus told so many parables in the Bible, is because he could say something directly, but it doesn't always sink in, as opposed to a parable or a story or a poem. Like you said, you think about it a day later, like, oh, that's what he was saying. That makes a whole lot more sense. And your mind runs with all the different pieces of the poem or the parable to maybe draw different things out that you might not have gotten if someone just directly told you the point.
Yeah, I certainly think our brains are hardwired for stories,
Yeah.
and certainly it's interesting how Jesus was good at telling stories, and he ended a lot of his stories with question marks or with huge pieces left
Huge
missing, right?
blanks,
And that's
right?
called gapping. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. He was the master. So what real quick, like what word of advice would you give to somebody who maybe wants to develop that poetry writing muscle? Because like I love to write and I enjoy reading poetry, but I have absolutely no idea where to begin when it comes to writing poetry. Like I've tried, but I get really annoyed with myself. I don't know if I'm like trying too hard, but like what is your advice for somebody who maybe just wants to sit down and experiment a little bit with writing their own poetry?
Well, um, it's oh, wow. That's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, I could give you a reading list, but that reading
Mhm.
list would be, idiosyncratic and based on my preferences to a certain degree. Um, One thing I'd say is that poetry is all about compression, where there's a difference between a poem and a newspaper article,
Yeah.
and a poem is about um, trying to compress as much meaning into as small a space as possible. And you have these tools in your toolbox. There's things like rhythm, meter,
Mhm.
repetition, um, imagery, uh, diction, which just means word choice, right? Um, to try to uh, compress meaning.
Mm.
So one thing I'd say that's kind of interesting. Let's say you sometimes when people start out trying to write poetry, um, they're kind of afraid or hesitant to really jump in the deep end, and I find they do too much explaining.
Yeah.
So let's say you like write a poem, okay, and like first off, don't worry if it's good or not. The tragedy isn't you writing a bad poem. The tragedy is you not writing a poem. So just go and do it.
Mm.
Okay. And once you do it, one thing that's fun sometimes is think to yourself, um, you know how a normal speech, or if you're writing nonfiction, you have like ligaments, like parts of grammar that are like connective tissue, things like so then I, and then
Mhm.
therefore because, so the naturally I. So look at the poem you wrote and think to yourself, what if I went back and got rid of all of the ligaments and
Mm.
all those like connective tissue? Like, so in your poem, take out
Mhm.
the word I, take out the word and, take out the word because.
Mm.
First off, if you need to use the word because, you should rewrite the poem because should be obvious because,
Mhm.
right? Um, because the because should be implicit in the image before,
Mm.
since, that, therefore, and you'll find that by getting rid
Mhm.
of that kind of business,
Yeah.
um, first off, it makes your page of writing seem stranger
Mm.
and more interesting, and also makes the imagery pop more.
Mm. It's almost like trimming away the fat and just kind of give the
Very
meat.
much so, very much
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of why I am so committed to poetry,
Mhm.
where people will come to me and say, "Oh, have you heard about this new novel? That's the flavor of the month." and then I'll say, "Good Lord, where was the editor? This should have been cut by a third,"
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so many great novels,
Hmm.
they start on page 100.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, like I want value for my book buying dollar. Start on page one,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I like to think that my book starts on page one, right?
Sure.
Where as soon as you jump in there, you're already with me at the bus stop, knee deep into my memories
Yeah.
and my problems. And yeah, in a novel, you'll have to get through 300 pages of setting the stage for the point.
Right.
And
Right.
with a poem, you make the point and it's over. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really good advice. I think maybe I'll give it another shot. Maybe I'll give it another try because I tried it about a year ago and I was like, I'm not gonna do this. So maybe I'll take your advice and trim away some fat and see what happens.
Also, another thing, um, if you have a long poem that's maybe 2 pages long, look at it and think to
Hmm.
yourself, here's a 2-page poem. What if it was a 1-page poem, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying, what if, right?
Mm,
What's the harm in taking this poem and cutting it up into 2 poems and seeing what happens?
mm.
And just look at every line and make sure that is every line like, am I just repeating the point already made, or is this adding some new fresh imagery or some new bit of information that leads to the ending?
It's good advice. All right. So what I thought we could do, Daryl, is maybe spend the rest of our time doing a poetry reading of sort, where you read for us some of your favorite poems from the book, and maybe tell us some of the story behind those poems and how they tie into your life, some of the heart behind them. I don't know, three, four, five poems, whatever's going to give us a good snapshot of Darrell Epp. Does that sound good?
That sounds good to me, that's for sure. Just give me a
Perfect.
second to get organized.
Yeah. No, take your time. Take your time. I'll also say while we're waiting, I've read obviously your poems, but I've also heard your poems spoken by you in some different videos. And the feeling that comes across versus reading it or having it spoken to you is entirely different for me anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of a funny story where this is my fifth book,
Yeah.
and I've actually had people in my life say to me that they thought my books were really depressing until they heard me read them live,
Right.
and then that's when they realized that they were funny. Um, and I thought, well, yeah, why would I write a book if it wasn't funny? Like I certainly laughed when I was writing it.
Right.
You know, um, and it's funny. I always had this thing where my reading voice is kind of a monotone, and now I just kind of lean into that, where people seem to get a kick out of the fact that they like the contrast between the strange stuff happening in the poems and the monotone uh, delivery.
Mm,
So I just play into that.
there you go. It's an art.
Yeah. So um, this is a poem which actually I don't think is in that book. It's in the next one, but don't tell anyone. Um,
Nobody needs to know.
Poem and um, uh, yeah, it's about someone I knew who died, and when she died, I was kind of appalled that nothing changed, and everything just the world just kept on turning, everyone
Mm,
just kept on shopping. So I wrote in a few poems about her. Yeah, this is a poem called um, Hootenanny Ephemeralis. Caught a fish with a fish in its mouth, looking nervously past my shoulder for the food chain's puppet master. Whose hook am I on? I asked the trout. All this time, I thought I was dancing because I wanted to. Driving by Ephra's old place in the shadow of the shuttered foundry still rattles me like a roller coaster that needs its bolts tightened. With her gone, I can't even trust the Pythagorean theorem. And why ask me about elections 7 time zones away when the back of my head is missing? My skin sack hangs slack like Salvation Army spandex. 5 days without sleeping is my record. Sticky fingers and ace of spades are also records. Ever wonder where we'd be without slave labor? Our cell phones would still be in the ground, spooning with the fossilized trilobites. All that strip mining for one novelty belt buckle, such egregious inefficiencies. The itching is driving me insane, but pulling on the arrow in my heart just makes it worse. And all that blood's probably fake anyhow. Have you ever tried to stand up in a kayak? That's what 12 years of night shift was like, when all I wanted was a participation trophy and a heroic part to play in Martian politics. Not the telescope's Mars, Hollywood's Mars, with towering pyramids, unsmiling frost queens, and weather machines. Have you ever roasted dinosaurs in a castle made of ice while gloomy parallelograms crept over the silent hedges? We should hang out sometime. So there's one down.
Yeah. So talk to me about like take a piece of that imagery. Whether it's the piece about the cell phones or the dinosaurs. You talk about how you wrote this in the wake of your friend passing away. Like what is that imagery? Where does that imagery come from? Like what is it referring to in your kind of remembrance of this person and their life and the wake of their passing?
Sure. Um, and hopefully this will be of some help to aspiring writers or writers who are listening. But
Mhm.
basically, writing is hard work. And to do it well, it takes a lot of energy. And to really meet the challenge, you have to go to the hot zone and write about what you're really obsessed with.
Mhm.
And so, first off, find out what that is, right? And so, before you write, make a list of things that really bug you. And when I say that, I don't mean like Donald Trump, because that's like saying you like chocolate. Like you know like everyone says that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
But do you know that conversation you had 15 years ago with that douchebag, and you just can't forget it, and you wish you could, stuff like that. Right?
Mhm.
So just find something that really bugs you, and the things you dream about, and things you just can't stop thinking about. And uh, it turns out I have a thing for um, the science fiction dreams we were sold in the 20th century, how they've sort of blossomed in kind of hideous, dreary ways in the
Mhm.
21st century. So I kind of, it's so basically find out what your obsession is, and it
Yeah.
won't be the same as mine because you're a different person, but whatever that is, lean into it.
Mhm.
Um, so, and then you'll build up this trick bag of images that are up to the task. Like, for example, I had a previous book where I mentioned Lego a lot in the book, where I was trying to talk about how um, in our society, people are going for for the simulacra of the real thing more than the real thing,
Mhm.
and that everything's becoming chintzy and cheap and plastic. And again, um, if you just say that directly, you'll just sound like the crackpot at the end of the bar, and there's one in every bar. It's not really, you know, exciting. But if instead in that book I mentioned Lego a few times, and then hopefully after like the fifth time, the reader would start to think, "What's the deal with Lego? What do I know
Right.
about Lego?"
Yeah.
You know, and like, oh, he's saying that our world that the is built out of like chintzy plastic building blocks. And so in the
Mm.
book you see people who are on the verge of noticing that there's something wrong,
Yeah.
that everything is kind of low quality and chintzy, but they still have this desire for the transcendental. um, and they're being told like, oh wow, we can't give you something transcendental, but we can give you lower prices or 2-for-1
Yeah.
specials or whatever. Like, no, they have this hunger for the transcendental, right? So in that poem, it kind of started with, like I mentioned,
Mhm.
my friend, um, who was a real person, and then along the way, I sort of just bump into these other things where I have to say, it talking about how you build a poem isn't exactly like talking about how you change a fuse,
Mhm.
because for me, a big part of the fun of writing a poem is the spontaneity in the process.
Yeah.
And when you're changing a fuse or fixing a leaky sink, you don't want any spontaneity. That's the opposite of what you want.
Right.
But that's a big part of the surprise, where in this kind of poetry, you can start with something, and one image will remind you of another image,
Yeah.
and and I hope it doesn't sound arty farty, because the fact is, this is how your brain works.
Mhm.
Where you'll be walking down the street and you'll think, "Oh wow, I need to get sour cream," and then suddenly you'll think about the $6 million man, or you'll think about something else, and you'll think, "Why did I suddenly think of that?" Or wow, I haven't thought of that person in 10 years. Why am I thinking about her?
Mhm.
And from the time you walk to your house to the 7-Eleven, your brain will just make is uh, being bombarded with all this sensory data, but at top speed. It's trying to regulate and organize the sensory data into a form that will create a worldview for you,
Mhm.
that will enable you to survive
Yeah.
and cross the street without getting hit by a car,
Yeah.
so you can survive.
Mm.
But at the same time, you're having all these daydreams. So like I said, I kind of bounced around with writing for a long time and
Mhm.
read a lot, did all my homework. And as a writer, the more time you spend doing your homework,
Mhm.
the more you'll be allowed to allow spontaneity to add to the process.
Mm.
Um, so in that poem, I could say, wow, on the one hand, I miss this person. That's an actual fact. But then uh, um, rhythm and meter in poetry allows you to get away with a lot of stuff.
Mm.
Where again, the difference between this and a newspaper article is being pleasing to the ear.
Mhm.
Where if every line has a pleasant sound and a fresh, funny image, that kind of gives the reader an impetus to keep reading, um, so that by the end, um, they can look back and say, "Oh wow, that was like a juggling act. I wasn't sure you were going to be able to keep all those bowling pins in the air, but you
Right.
did it. Bravo!"
Yeah. No, that's good. That's one of the questions I was going to ask you was about the spontaneity piece because like I talked to a few fiction writers on the show who some people say that they have the whole plot kind of planned out before they start writing. Other people say it kind of comes to them as they're writing the story. So I was curious about that piece because like in that poem you just read, there were so many different images in there and I was curious, did you have these images like in your mind before you wrote the poem or did they just kind of come to you as you're writing? So it makes sense that you talk about how the poem develops almost the way that the brain works and that you have these different associations that you make and it just kind of comes together.
Yeah. Um, One thing, when I started writing poetry, I thought, wow, this form can allow you to do a lot of cool effects.
Yeah.
And then a few years into it, I actually thought to myself, wow, this form allows you to really simulate consciousness,
Hmm.
in the sense that when you're walking to buy sour cream, you can think about a fictional character as easily as you can about a real person, or the past as the future. And there's no real barriers of time and space when you're daydreaming. So in a poem, you know how like in a novel you have setting, rising action, climax, denouement, right?
Hmm.
And it's like, does your day feel like it was plotted like a Tom Clancy novel,
Mm.
or does it feel more like a Marc Chagall collage? And in a poem, you can just really capture, I think, more of what it's like to be alive
Yeah.
by just jumping in and saying, "This is what this is what happened." And it's like, if I say, "What did you do today?" You
Mm.
wouldn't say, "I sat in a chair for 8 hours." Um, the most interesting parts of your day happened between your ears, you know.
That's right.
And I know there are writers who write a novel and they have the ending planned out
Yeah.
before they start writing.
Yeah.
And you know, um, I don't want to criticize anyone, right? But
Mhm.
I don't really get that. I always thought when I was writing a story, if I knew how it was going to end, I thought, why would I bother writing it? Why not just think about it? And I was always a big believer in, if I'm surprised by how a story ends, there's a much better chance the reader will be surprised.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
I think it's, just in hearing you talk about that, I think that, I mean, that could segue easily into one's theology. And I'm not gonna ask you any theology questions, but just like, for me growing up, like I just believed that God had this blueprint of the universe and my life was all planned out and it's gonna happen the way that it happens. But now I'm in this place where I've kind of abandoned that idea and I just kind of believe that life happens the way that it happens and the divine or whatever is with me for the ride. So I feel like my life is more like a poem, the development of a poem, as opposed to this outline story that's in this perfect format and it's going to end the way that the grand master has decided it's going to end.
I think that's great because I certainly have a lot of problems with our mass media entertainment at the moment.
Mm.
And I hate superhero movies. I hate most things that people like. but but I really think there's something fascist and ugly about a lot of the stories we've been told about how um, we're we're brainwashed to wait for some hero to come and save the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I really hate that crap. And there's so much modern entertainment that is basically just might makes right, and it's okay if this guy uses force because his lightsaber is a certain color or something, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just awful. And uh the, and yeah, this sounds, I don't want to sound arrogant, or maybe I do, but I really think what I'm trying to do is get to something that is true. And when I say true, I mean something that is universal. It's something that doesn't change.
Yeah.
And it's like, when you read poetry from 1,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, you can hear a voice that has the same complaint
Yeah.
or the same problem that you have. And there are these things that are universal, right?
Yeah. That's right. All right. So give us another poem. What's next on your list for us?
Okay, this is a poem, and if you buy the book Permanent Smoke, this is page 48.
Hmm.
This is a poem called Left Handed Poem for a New Economy. I've made a lot of mistakes, but not the ones you're thinking of. Did I really jump off a helicopter into a speeding convertible? Or was that the TV detective who held my hand after layoff number 4? So hard to tell Bigfoots from bad guys this close to the finish line. Lego flowed like a river until it wound up in the sea, ensnared by tuna nets and vast schools of bubble wrap. The Catholic Sisters of St. Anne's gave me water during a heat wave, and Rockefeller's interest kept accumulating. I glimpsed two competing economies, a new math without winners, losers, gave my head a shake. A butterfly blotted out the sun, laughed, disappeared. The gleeful watchmaker behind the curtain, immune to time's ravages, gave the color wheel an extra spin. I wore out my shoes for just one smile, played hide and seek with the security guard in the impound lot, looked up just as the cargo jet flashed its landing lights, took it as a divine sign. Hairless hatchling dodges traffic, even sniffs the far off nest.
Mm.
Will the NAFTA superhighway let her live? There is no wrong answer in a choose your own adventure book. I'm left handed means I'm sinister, means scissors are a challenge, means I'm more likely to die on the factory floor. Your tools weren't made with my kind in mind. Lost so many coins at the wishing well, you'd think I'd take the hint. There's a poem.
Hmm. So what's going on in that poem? What's going on in your mind as you're writing this poem?
Well, it's kind of funny. What you were saying about the last poem, about
Hmm.
how you would change your mind about how the world works and how the world was plotted.
Yeah.
Um, uh, um, it seems that as I'm aging, which I'm doing rapidly now, it's like the old joke about, you know, gradually then suddenly, right?
Right.
So I've really become more interested in gratitude,
Hmm.
and I really think it's important that as you age, you make an effort to become more grateful.
Mm.
And it's like if you wanted to become a piano player, you'd have to practice.
Mm.
But people think you can end up being a grateful person without practicing, which is weird. So my wife and I try to, find, try to practice that.
Mm.
And basically, in this poem, I did have an experience of, going to a food bank about 3 or 4 years ago and getting food from these people. And that was a really interesting experience because, on the one hand, in our culture, and obviously, what I'm saying now, it isn't unique to me. I didn't think of this.
Hmm.
It's obvious, but we are told in our culture that you know Selena Gomez, what happened to her today is really important because she's really a lot more attractive than we are,
Mm.
or whatever. And what this person did is really important because they're very wealthy. Um, and we're told this so often, it becomes obvious. Like people want to be successful, attractive, and wealthy. Um, but the funny thing is, no matter what happens, you're all going to die.
Mm.
You're all going to get old and weak and frail and turn to dust. So that's kind of a wash. So you know, what do you do with that knowledge, right? It's
Yeah.
kind of funny.
Yeah.
Um, so you're under this huge pressure whenever you step outside to, uh, well, basically, my I hope my books make people pay more attention to their
Hmm.
lives and their surroundings,
Yeah.
because if they don't, and if they just sleepwalk through their day when they're making their rounds, by default, that area of their mental landscape will be colonized by people who don't have their best interests at heart.
Yeah.
So I just thought, wow, these people are in the news over here because they're billionaires and they did $1 billion thing over here. And then I'm here standing in line at this food bank to get free food from these people. And and I just thought to myself, no, I dare to say that what is happening right now is important.
Mm.
and these people here are important, even if they'll never be in a newspaper
Yeah.
or, uh, go viral or something.
Yeah.
So I guess the starting point for the poem was trying to talk about that, about how that's one thing that did actually happen to me of using this food bank.
Mm.
And then just thinking about how there is always this war on about um, what you will focus your attention on.
Mm. It's really good. So last question, why permanent smoke? What does this title mean in
Oh
regards to your
yeah,
poems? Yeah.
yeah. I came up with that poem about 7 years ago,
Hmm.
with that idea 7 years ago, and I wanted to write a book about my hometown of Hamilton, which is on the western tip of Lake Ontario, and was until very recently a steel town where they made steel,
Mm.
kind of like a Baltimore or Pittsburgh, I guess you might say. And now, due to robotics, we make a lot more steel than we used to, while we employ 90% less people doing
Hmm.
it.
Yep.
So that's obviously a concern about what do you do when you have a generation of young men who don't have decent jobs, right? And that's a problem that's happening like all over.
Yeah.
So I had this idea to write a book about that, and it was called Permanent Smoke because on the one hand, out my window, I see a lot of smokestacks,
Hmm.
and also uh, smoke isn't permanent; it's ephemeral.
Hmm.
And I also wanted the book to be about the ephemerality of memory and about how, uh, on the one hand, people got their identity from these steel mills that employed them, and now they're gone, and
Mm.
about how your memory sort of makes sense of this after the fact. So, on the one hand, it was called Permanent Smoke because of where I live, being a steel town,
Mm.
and also about uh, just the way our brains try to construct a coherent point of view about it all, kind of armchair quarterbacking reality after the fact. So then I thought to myself, the longest street in Hamilton is Barton Street. Um, it's a very long street. So I had this idea where I said, I'll do a book where every poem on the book takes place at an intersection on Barton Street.
Mm.
And I thought that'll be a great way to talk about the history of the town and also about things that are universal. Here's the exercise. Imagine there's an intersection in your town in North Carolina where you've stood there 1,000 times. So next time you stand there, think to yourself, on this intersection, what happened here 5 years ago? What happened here 50 years ago? What happened here 100 years ago? What happened
Mhm.
on these coordinates 300 years ago? And at the very least, that will make your day more interesting.
Mm.
So I had this idea. So, for example, about a few blocks from here, um, uh, near Barden and Victoria, they had a factory where they made Studebaker cars, where men could go to a job where they made enough money so they could have a wife who doesn't work, kids, a car, a boat, a cottage,
Mm.
and and they could walk to work. And then when Studebaker shut down in 1963, um, that was when the whole commuter age started about you don't want to live downtown, you want to live in the suburbs
Mm.
and not know who your neighbors are. And that's when our communities really got atomized. So what happened to the Studebaker plant out my window, I think it's important, but it's also kind of emblematic of things that happened all over the Western Hemisphere.
Mm.
So then I had this idea for this book, and then I wrote a bit of it, and then suddenly I lost interest, and it sounded too much like work, where I was doing research and stuff. And I thought, suddenly it's not as much fun. And then I thought, if it's not fun for me, how could it be fun for the reader?
Mm.
So I put that project on hold and wrote another book. And then years later, I had this idea where I thought, what if I just took that bit and made it a section of a book instead of the whole book? So it had like, so the whole book had different flavors.
Yeah.
So that's what happened now, where Permanent Smoke has about 50 poems, then 25 poems about Barden Street, and
Mm.
then the short story at the end.
Yeah. Wow. I love it, man. I could listen to you tell me stories all day long. But we're just about out of time. But this has been a lot of fun, really. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and thank you for this great work you're putting in the world.
Well, I really appreciate having you as a reader. That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, for sure. And where can people go online to interact with you and maybe some of your work? Any specific
Well,
places you want to point them to?
yeah, sure. Um, the main thing is the book Permanent Smoke is on Amazon, Kindle,
Mhm.
paperback, but I'm on Twitter all day long, and my Twitter handle is my name, Darrell Epp.
Awesome. Well, I'll put the link to that in the show notes and obviously the link to your books as well. Maybe we can do
Okay,
this
well,
again
thank you
sometime.
so much.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
great.
Thanks, Daryl.
Yeah.